The morning shift began like every other morning on Outpost 73, with the twin suns of the Kepler frontier system casting pale orange light through the reinforced viewports. Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart down the narrow corridor of Sector 4, the wheels squeaking against the metal floor in a rhythm he had long since stopped noticing. The cart held the usual supplies: industrial solvent, microfiber cloths, a plasma torch for stubborn carbon scoring, and a data pad that nobody ever asked to see. He was 52 years old, with gray threading through his brown hair and permanent creases around his eyes from years of squinting at distant stars through observation windows while everyone else looked past him. The Galactic Patrol officers streaming past him on their way to the morning briefing barely registered his existence. A Valorian lieutenant with crimson scales and 3 rows of teeth brushed past without slowing, nearly knocking the solvent bottle from the cart. Marcus steadied it without comment, stepping aside as 2 Krell enforcers in their heavy armor stomped through, their conversation loud and dismissive. They were discussing the latest border skirmish, how the human colonies were always causing problems, how Earth species had no place in serious military operations. Marcus kept his eyes down and continued pushing the cart. Just another piece of equipment in a facility designed for beings far more important than himself. Outpost 73 sat on the edge of what the Galactic Patrol called the Frontier Zone, a vast stretch of space where legitimate shipping lanes bled into lawless territory. The outpost itself was a utilitarian structure, built by the Confederation of Advanced Worlds 200 years ago, when humanity had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. It consisted of 3 main levels: command and operations on top, living quarters and support services in the middle, and maintenance and storage in the lower level where Marcus spent most of his time. The architecture reflected typical Confederation aesthetics, all smooth metallic surfaces and bioluminescent panels, designed by species who found human preferences for right angles and warm colors primitive and inefficient. Marcus had worked at the outpost for 23 years, ever since his discharge from the Human Auxiliary Forces. Nobody remembered that he had once worn a uniform, that he had seen combat in the Outer Rim conflicts, that he held commendations for valor that now sat in a drawer back in his tiny quarters. The patrol had needed bodies to fill support positions after the expansion, and a human janitor was cheap, unobtrusive, and easily ignored. He had taken the job because it kept him near the frontier, near the places where things happened, and because nobody asked questions about a man willing to clean up after species who considered themselves superior. The morning briefing room was on the 2nd level, and Marcus timed his cleaning schedule to coincide with the officers filing in. He worked slowly near the door, wiping down the exterior panels, while voices drifted out from inside. Commander Zekthor, the Valorian in charge of the outpost, was reviewing patrol reports in his characteristic growl. 3 ships had detected unusual energy signatures near the Theta corridor in the past week, but nothing had triggered the automated alert systems. The commander dismissed it as background radiation from a nearby nebula, his tone suggesting that any officer concerned about routine anomalies should reconsider their fitness for duty. Marcus made a mental note of the Theta corridor reference as he moved down the hall. His cart squeaked past the communications center, where a Therian operator sat surrounded by holographic displays, her 4 arms moving in practiced synchronization across the controls. She did not look up as he emptied the recycling unit near her station. Humans were background noise, part of the infrastructure, as invisible as the ventilation systems that kept the station's atmosphere breathable. He had long ago stopped trying to make conversation with the patrol officers. They did not want to hear about his observations or his thoughts on border security. They wanted clean floors and functioning waste disposal, and Marcus provided both without complaint. The lower level was Marcus's domain, though nobody would have called it that. This was where the outpost stored supplies, housed the environmental processors, and kept the backup generators that kicked in during the rare power fluctuations. It was also where Marcus had his maintenance workshop, a cluttered space filled with spare parts, diagnostic tools, and equipment that the patrol considered obsolete, but Marcus found useful. He spent his afternoons here after the cleaning rounds were complete, ostensibly performing routine maintenance, but actually monitoring systems that nobody else bothered to check. The data pad on his cart was linked to the outpost's secondary sensor network, a legacy system from the station's original construction that the current administrators had forgotten about. The Galactic Patrol relied on sophisticated AI-driven surveillance, quantum entanglement communication arrays, and predictive threat algorithms that supposedly made older monitoring technology irrelevant. But Marcus had learned decades ago that sophisticated systems had sophisticated blind spots, and that sometimes the old ways of watching and listening caught things that algorithms missed. He pulled up the sensor logs from the past 72 hours, scrolling through pages of data while his hands automatically sorted through a bin of damaged conduit covers. The energy signatures in the theta corridor were not background radiation. The pattern was too regular, too focused, and the frequency matched nothing in the standard database of natural phenomena. It looked like a scanning pulse, the kind of thing a reconnaissance drone would emit while mapping defensive positions. Marcus had seen it before, years ago during the Outer Rim conflicts, right before a raider fleet had hit an undefended supply depot. He made another note on his personal log, a handwritten journal he kept in the workshop. The patrol would not listen if he reported it through official channels. A janitor's opinion on tactical matters was worth less than nothing, and filing an unauthorized report would likely get him reprimanded for accessing systems above his clearance level. But Marcus kept the journal anyway, documenting the patterns he saw, the anomalies that others dismissed, the small inconsistencies that sometimes added up to something larger. If nothing came of the energy signatures, the notes would gather dust with all the others. If something did happen, at least there would be a record that someone had noticed. The afternoon brought its usual rotation of duties. Marcus cleaned the officers' mess while they ate and joked in a dozen different languages, none of them acknowledging his presence even when he had to reach past them to wipe down a table. He serviced the environmental processors in the lower level, replacing filters and checking pressure readings in the maze of pipes and conduits that kept the station habitable. He restocked supplies in the medical bay, where a Krell physician looked through him as though he were made of glass, and he swept the landing bay while a patrol ship came in from the frontier, its pilot complaining loudly about another uneventful run. Evening shift meant fewer personnel, which Marcus preferred. He could work without the constant reminder of his place in the station's hierarchy, without the casual dismissals and occasional outright contempt. The Outpost ran on a 26-hour cycle to match the primary sun's rotation, and the quiet hours between shift changes were when Marcus did his real work. He returned to his workshop and accessed the secondary sensor network again, pulling up historical data and comparing it to the current readings. The pattern was clearer now. The energy signatures were growing stronger, and they had shifted position, moving along the border of the theta corridor in a search grid. Whatever was out there was getting closer, and it was definitely looking for something. Marcus cross-referenced the location with old star charts, the kind that showed things the modern navigation systems had deleted as irrelevant. The Theta Corridor had been a supply route during the early expansion period, back when human ships were still learning to navigate the frontier. There were abandoned way stations out there, old beacons and emergency shelters that nobody had bothered to decommission because nobody remembered they existed. One of those way stations was less than a light year from Outpost 73. It had been built by the first human exploratory missions, a small facility designed to support ships making the long journey into uncharted space. The Galactic Patrol's records did not mention it because human contributions to frontier exploration were generally written out of official histories or attributed to more prestigious species. But Marcus knew it was there because he had helped build it, back when he was young and idealistic and believed that humanity's determination to push into the unknown would earn respect from the older civilizations. The way station had been abandoned for 40 years, left to drift in the dark while newer, more sophisticated facilities replaced it. But the location was still strategically valuable, close enough to current patrol routes to serve as an observation post, isolated enough to hide activities from casual scans. If someone wanted to monitor Galactic Patrol movements without being detected, the old way station would be an ideal base of operations. And if someone was searching the Theta Corridor with increasing intensity, they might be looking for exactly that kind of hidden vantage point. Marcus considered his options. He could file a formal report, submit his analysis through the proper channels, and hope that someone would take it seriously despite coming from a human janitor with no official intelligence training. The likely outcome was dismissal, possibly disciplinary action for exceeding his authority, and the certainty that whatever was happening in the Theta corridor would continue unnoticed until it was too late. Alternatively, he could keep watching, keep documenting, and prepare for the possibility that he might need to act on his own when the threat became impossible to ignore. He chose the second option because it was the one that might actually make a difference. Marcus Webb had spent 23 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as part of the furniture in a station that protected the frontier from dangers its officers could not always see. He had accepted that role because it gave him access, because it let him watch and learn and position himself where he might be useful when the moment came. If that moment was approaching, if the energy signatures in the Theta corridor meant what he suspected they meant, then being a humble janitor might be the best cover he could possibly have. The evening wore on into night cycle, and Marcus continued his work. He updated his personal logs, backed up the sensor data to an encrypted storage device that he kept hidden in his quarters, and reviewed his emergency protocols. These were plans he had developed over years of quiet preparation, contingencies for scenarios that the Galactic Patrol did not believe could happen because their systems were too advanced to be surprised. Marcus knew better. He had learned the hard way that confidence was the first step toward vulnerability, and that the most dangerous threats were the ones that exploited the certainty that you were too important to be caught off guard. Before retiring to his quarters, Marcus made one final check of the lower level. This was habit, a routine inspection that nobody had ever asked him to perform, but that he completed anyway. He walked the corridors, checking seals and testing emergency lighting, making sure that the backup systems would activate if the primary power failed. The lower level was quieter than the upper sections, insulated from the constant activity of command operations, and Marcus appreciated the solitude. Here, in the forgotten spaces beneath the outpost, he could think without interruption and work without scrutiny. There was a section of the lower level that Marcus visited most nights, a maintenance junction near the environmental processors where the original construction plans showed a slight inconsistency. The walls were thicker than necessary in that area, the space between structural supports larger than standard design would require. When Marcus had first noticed the discrepancy years ago, he had investigated, carefully and quietly, using tools and techniques that were not part of a janitor's normal duties. What he had found was a secret that he had kept ever since, a truth that changed everything about his presence at Outpost 73. Behind a panel in the maintenance junction, concealed by decades of dust and disuse, was a hatch. It led down into a tunnel that the Galactic Patrol did not know existed, a passage that extended deep beneath the outpost's foundation and connected to systems that predated the station's current configuration. Marcus descended the ladder in the darkness, his movements sure and practiced until he reached a chamber that no official inspection had ever discovered. Here, surrounded by equipment that hummed quietly in the shadows, Marcus Webb stopped being a janitor and became what he had always been, a guardian, a watcher, and the last line of defense for a frontier that had forgotten how to protect itself. He checked the monitors in the hidden chamber, reviewing data streams that the Outpost's command center never saw. The energy signatures were stronger now, and there were more of them. Whatever was coming had moved beyond reconnaissance. They were preparing for something larger, something that would arrive soon, and when it did, the Galactic Patrol's contempt for the humble janitor who cleaned their floors would prove to be a mistake that could cost them everything. Marcus made his final notes, secured the chamber, and climbed back up to the maintenance junction. Tomorrow would bring more cleaning, more dismissals, more invisibility. But tomorrow would also bring the truth closer to the surface, and Marcus Webb would be ready when the moment came to step out of the shadows and show them all what humanity's hidden strength could accomplish. The discovery happened 3 days later, though not in the way Marcus had anticipated. He was in the lower level performing routine maintenance on the atmospheric recyclers when he heard boots on the metal stairs, too many of them and moving with the purposeful cadence of an investigation team. Marcus set down his tools and listened, his body going still in the way that had kept him alive during his combat years. The voices were tense, official, speaking in galactic standard with the clipped precision of officers who had found something they were not supposed to find. Commander Zekthor's growl was unmistakable even from a distance. The Valorian was angry, which was his default state. But there was something else in his tone now, a sharp edge of confusion that Marcus had never heard before. The commander was demanding answers, asking how long the anomaly had been there, why the structural scans had never detected it. A Krell engineer was responding in defensive technical jargon, insisting that the original construction plans showed no irregularities and that the current scans were clearly malfunctioning. Marcus moved quietly toward his cleaning cart, making sure his presence seemed coincidental rather than suspicious. He had been expecting scrutiny eventually, but not this soon, and not triggered by whatever the investigation team had stumbled across. The energy signatures in the Theta corridor were still building, still suggesting an imminent threat, but apparently something else had captured the patrol's attention. He pushed the cart toward the maintenance junction, timing his arrival to look like ordinary work rather than careful positioning. The investigation team had set up portable scanners near the environmental processors, the same area where Marcus knew the hidden hatch was located. There were 6 officers in total, Commander Zekthor with his crimson scales gleaming under the harsh work lights, 2 Krell engineers in their heavy armor running diagnostic equipment, a Therian security specialist with her 4 arms manipulating a holographic display, and 2 human auxiliary officers who stood at the back looking uncomfortable. The humans were younger than Marcus, probably recent transfers, and they kept glancing at him with expressions that suggested they recognized what he represented. The bottom of the Galactic Patrol's hierarchy, the position they desperately hoped to rise above. Commander Zekthor noticed Marcus and dismissed him with a gesture, the universal signal for unimportant personnel to leave the area. Marcus nodded and began to retreat, but the Therian security specialist spoke up, her voice carrying the musical quality of her species. She said they should keep all station personnel in the area until they determined what they were dealing with. It was standard protocol for potential security breaches, and the commander grudgingly agreed, ordering Marcus to stay where he was and keep quiet. The scanning equipment was sophisticated, far more advanced than anything Marcus had in his hidden chamber. The engineers were running deep penetration scans, the kind that could map subsurface structures down to individual conduits and support beams. On the holographic display, Marcus could see the outline of the outpost's lower level taking shape in 3 dimensions, and there, unmistakable in the data, was the hollow space beneath the maintenance junction. The tunnel showed as a dark void in the scans, an absence where solid foundation should have been, extending down and away from the outpost's official structure like a hidden root system. The Krell engineers were baffled. One of them insisted that such a tunnel would have required years to excavate, specialized equipment, and enough noise to wake every officer in the station. The other argued that it must be a natural formation, some kind of erosion or geological quirk, except that the outpost was built on an artificial platform suspended above the planet's surface, and there was no geology to erode. Commander Zekthor silenced them both with a snarl, and demanded that someone open the access point and determine what was actually down there. The Therian security specialist located the concealed hatch with practiced efficiency, her scanners identifying the panel that Marcus had used for years. She carefully removed the cover, revealing the ladder descending into darkness, and the entire team went silent. This was not a recent construction. The hatch mechanism was old, the metal worn smooth by decades of use, and the tunnel below extended far beyond what the preliminary scans had shown. Whatever this was, it had been here long before most of the current patrol officers had been assigned to the outpost. Commander Zekthor ordered the security specialist to take a team down and investigate. The Therian selected one of the Krell engineers and both human auxiliary officers, leaving the commander and the remaining engineer at the top with their scanning equipment. She also pointed at Marcus and said to bring the janitor. When the commander questioned why they needed a maintenance worker for a security investigation, the Therian replied that if this tunnel connected to the station's systems, they might need someone familiar with the lower levels infrastructure. Her real reason, Marcus suspected, was that she did not trust him to be left alone after seeing his reaction when they uncovered the hatch. Marcus had kept his expression carefully neutral, but the Therian had been watching him closely. Her species was known for reading subtle cues, for detecting the micro-expressions and body language that revealed hidden knowledge. She had seen something in Marcus's face when the hatch was revealed, some flicker of recognition that told her he knew more than a simple janitor should. Now, she wanted him close where she could observe him, and Marcus had no choice but to comply. The descent into the tunnel was tense and slow. The Therian led with her weapon drawn, a plasma rifle that could cut through armor plating. The Krell engineer followed with a portable scanner, documenting everything as they moved deeper. The two human auxiliary officers came next, their faces showing the strain of trying to prove they belonged in the Galactic Patrol despite their species' reputation. Marcus brought up the rear, his hands empty and his posture submissive, playing the role of the confused civilian caught up in military operations. The tunnel was exactly as Marcus remembered it, a precisely engineered passage with reinforced walls and environmental controls that kept the air breathable and the temperature stable. Emergency lighting activated as they descended, sensors responding to their presence with a soft glow that illuminated the path ahead. The Therian noticed immediately that the lights were functioning, that power was running through systems the Outpost's engineers knew nothing about, and her grip on the rifle tightened. They reached the bottom of the ladder and entered the main chamber. It was larger than the preliminary scans had suggested. A circular room approximately 50 feet in diameter with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. The walls were lined with equipment, some of it clearly ancient but maintained in working condition. There were monitors showing data feeds, communication arrays with crystalline components that predated modern quantum systems, and storage units made from materials that the Krell engineer did not immediately recognize. The center of the chamber held a workstation with multiple displays, and on those displays were live feeds from sensors positioned throughout the frontier. The Therian approached carefully, her forearms moving in a defensive pattern as she studied the screens. One monitor showed the Theta corridor with its energy signatures clearly marked and analyzed. Another displayed traffic patterns for every ship that had entered or left Outpost 73 in the past month. A third showed communications intercepts, message fragments from encrypted channels that the Galactic Patrol's official systems had not detected. Commander Zekthor's voice crackled through the security specialist communicator, demanding a status report. The Therian took a moment before responding, her eyes moving from the monitors to Marcus and back again. She described what they had found in careful, measured terms. An underground intelligence facility, operational and sophisticated, monitoring activities that should have been under the patrol's exclusive purview. The commander's response was immediate and furious. He ordered everyone back to the surface immediately and placed the area under security lockdown. But the Therian did not move. She was still looking at Marcus, and her voice was quiet when she asked how long he had known about this place. Marcus met her gaze without flinching and replied that he had known for 23 years because he was the one who maintained it. The human auxiliary officers stared at him in shock, but the Therian simply nodded, as though confirming something she had already suspected. She asked why a janitor would need an intelligence facility, and Marcus told her the truth. Because someone had to watch the frontier when the Galactic Patrol was too arrogant to see the threats that were coming. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and the Krell engineer bristled at the insult to the patrol's competence. He demanded to know who Marcus thought he was, what authority he claimed that gave him the right to conduct unauthorized surveillance. Marcus could have given them his service record, the commendations and the classified operations, the years he had spent fighting in conflicts that the patrol preferred to forget. Instead, he simply pointed at the monitor showing the Theta corridor and said that if they wanted to argue about authority, they should probably deal with the raider fleet that was getting ready to attack the outpost first. The monitor showed the energy signatures that Marcus had been tracking, but the analysis on his screens went far beyond what the outpost's official systems had detected. The signatures were not random. They formed a pattern consistent with a fleet assembling for assault, multiple ships coordinating their positions and scanning for defensive weaknesses. The estimated force strength was significant. At least 12 combat vessels, probably more hidden behind sensor baffles. The projected attack window was 48 hours, possibly less if they decided to move early. The Therian studied the data with professional focus, her earlier suspicion giving way to tactical assessment. She asked Marcus how reliable his information was and what sources he had used to compile it. Marcus explained that the sensors in the chamber were part of an old network built during the first expansion period when human explorers had pushed into the frontier without the sophisticated technology the modern patrol relied on. The network still functioned because nobody had bothered to shut it down, and it still detected things because it operated on principles that current stealth systems were not designed to defeat. The Krell engineer objected that such a network should be impossible, that the Galactic Patrol's own systems would have detected the sensors if they existed. Marcus showed him the technical specifications, the frequencies and signal patterns that the old network used. They were outside the standard scanning range, considered primitive and inefficient by modern standards, but they had the advantage of being completely invisible to anyone who assumed that only advanced technology was worth watching for. The raiders assembling in the Theta Corridor were using sophisticated stealth systems, but those systems were optimized against sophisticated detection, not against the kind of basic electromagnetic sensing that humanity had invented centuries ago. Commander Zekthor's voice came through the communicator again, more insistent now. The Therian requested permission to complete the investigation before evacuating the chamber, and the commander reluctantly agreed, but demanded a full report within the hour. The security specialist began documenting everything with her scanner, creating a detailed record of the equipment and the data it contained. The human auxiliary officers moved through the chamber, their initial shock giving way to curiosity as they realized what they were looking at. One of the young humans approached Marcus hesitantly and asked if he had built all of this himself. Marcus shook his head and explained that most of it had been here when he arrived, installed by the original human teams who had established the frontier outposts decades ago. His role had been to maintain the systems, to keep them operational, and to watch for patterns that others might miss. The officer asked why Marcus had never reported it, why he had kept it secret for so many years. Marcus replied that he had tried reporting anomalies through official channels multiple times, and every time his warnings had been dismissed or ignored because they came from a human janitor with no official standing. The Therian was listening to this exchange while she continued her documentation. She asked Marcus if the secret chamber was the only installation he maintained, and Marcus hesitated before answering. The truth was complicated and potentially dangerous, but the discovery of the chamber meant that secrecy was no longer sustainable. He told her that there were other facilities, other tunnels and hidden spaces scattered across the frontier where human teams had left behind monitoring equipment and emergency resources. Most of them were abandoned now, their locations forgotten, but a few remained operational because people like Marcus had chosen to keep them running. The Krell engineer demanded to know how many people were involved in this unauthorized network, how many janitors and maintenance workers were secretly conducting surveillance on the Galactic Patrol. Marcus clarified that it was not surveillance on the patrol, but surveillance for the patrol, monitoring threats that the official systems missed. As for how many people were involved, he honestly did not know. The network had started as an informal effort by human veterans who saw gaps in frontier security, and it had persisted because those gaps never closed. Some participants had died, others had retired, and the network had shrunk over the years until Marcus was one of the few remaining. Commander Zekthor arrived in the chamber personally, descending the ladder with barely controlled fury. The Valorian was even more imposing in the confined space, his scaled bulk and predator's bearing making everyone else seem smaller by comparison. He looked at Marcus with undisguised contempt and said that a human maintenance worker conducting unsanctioned intelligence operations was a security breach of the highest order and would be dealt with accordingly. Marcus stood his ground and replied that if the commander wanted to arrest him for treason, he should probably wait until after they survived the raider attack that was coming in less than 2 days. The commander dismissed the threat assessment as speculation, but the Therian interrupted and said that the data appeared credible based on her preliminary review. She recommended that they take the intelligence seriously regardless of its source, if only to verify whether the threat was real. Commander Zekthor growled that he would decide what threats were credible, but he ordered the engineer to copy all the sensor data and bring it to the command center for analysis. If Marcus's information proved accurate, the outpost would respond appropriately. If it proved to be false, Marcus would face charges for unauthorized access to military systems and possibly for fabricating intelligence to justify his illegal activities. The investigation team evacuated the chamber with Marcus in custody. He was not formally arrested, but 2 security officers escorted him to a holding room on the command level where he could be monitored while the intelligence was evaluated. The holding room was small and austere, with transparent walls that allowed constant observation and basic furniture that was bolted to the floor. Marcus sat calmly and waited, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his years of quiet vigilance would be vindicated or whether he would be punished for the crime of trying to protect people who had never wanted his protection. In the command center, the Galactic Patrol's analysts were reviewing the data from Marcus's sensors with growing concern. The energy signatures were real, and the threat assessment was disturbingly plausible. Additional scans of the Theta corridor confirmed the presence of multiple vessels operating in stealth mode, their profiles consistent with known raider configurations. The fleet was larger than Marcus had estimated. At least 15 ships with the capacity to overwhelm the outpost's defenses if they attacked in coordinated fashion. Commander Zekthor faced a decision that would define his career. He could acknowledge that a human janitor had detected a major threat that the Galactic Patrol's sophisticated systems had missed, which would be professionally humiliating but might save lives. Or he could dismiss the intelligence as unreliable and maintain his authority, which would preserve his reputation but leave the outpost vulnerable to attack. The Therian security specialist presented the analysis without commentary, letting the data speak for itself, and waited for the commander to choose which mattered more, his pride or his duty. The outpost went to heightened alert status 2 hours later. Combat ships were recalled from patrol, defensive systems were activated, and all personnel were briefed on emergency protocols. Commander Zekthor announced that credible intelligence indicated a possible hostile action in the near future, and that the Galactic Patrol would be ready to respond with overwhelming force. He did not mention where the intelligence had come from or who had provided it, allowing his officers to assume that their own systems had detected the threat through normal channels. Marcus remained in the holding room, watching through the transparent walls as the station transformed from complacent routine to disciplined preparation. Nobody came to brief him or ask him questions, and he did not expect them to. The Galactic Patrol had taken what they needed from his chamber, and now they would use it without acknowledgement, maintaining the fiction that human contributions to frontier security were negligible. Marcus had seen this pattern before, had experienced it throughout his years of service, and he no longer had the energy to be surprised or offended by it. But the Therian security specialist did come to see him, entering the holding room late in the night cycle when most of the station was either sleeping or standing watch. She sat across from Marcus and asked why he had done it, why he had spent 23 years maintaining systems that nobody appreciated and watching for threats that nobody believed existed. Marcus thought about the question for a long moment before answering. He said that during the Outer Rim conflicts, he had seen what happened when warnings were ignored and when the people responsible for security assumed they knew everything worth knowing. He had watched outposts fall and ships burn because someone had decided that certain sources of intelligence were not worth listening to, and he had promised himself that if he ever had the chance to prevent that kind of tragedy, he would take it regardless of whether anyone thanked him for it. The Therian listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, she told him that his data had probably saved the outpost and everyone in it. The raider fleet was real, the threat was imminent, and without his warning, they would have been caught completely unprepared. Commander Zekthor would never admit it publicly, but he knew the truth, and that knowledge would eat at him because it meant acknowledging that the Galactic Patrol's certainty in its own superiority had nearly gotten them all killed. She stood to leave, then paused at the door and said that whatever happened next, Marcus should know that at least one officer recognized what he had done and why it mattered. Marcus thanked her quietly and watched her go, alone again with his thoughts and the knowledge that the fight was only beginning. The raiders were coming, the outpost was preparing, and somewhere in the shadows between duty and recognition, a humble janitor had proven that humanity's hidden strength was far more valuable than the Galactic Patrol had ever wanted to believe. The raider fleet arrived 37 hours after Marcus's intelligence had been confirmed, emerging from the Theta corridor with the precision of a military operation. They came in 3 waves, staggered to overwhelm point defenses and create confusion among the defenders. The first wave consisted of 6 fast attack ships, their hulls painted matte black to minimize visual detection, and their energy signatures dampened by expensive stealth baffles. They swept past the outer sensor perimeter and launched a barrage of electromagnetic pulse missiles designed to disable the outpost's communication arrays and targeting systems. But Outpost 73 was ready. Commander Zekthor had positioned his combat ships in a defensive screen that anticipated the attack vector Marcus's analysis had predicted. The patrol's interceptors met the raiders head-on, their weapons firing in coordinated volleys that shredded the lead attack ship before it could complete its missile launch. The remaining raiders scattered, trying to exploit gaps in the defensive formation, but the Galactic Patrol had prepared multiple fallback positions, and the attackers found themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire. Marcus watched the battle from the holding room, his view limited to what the transparent walls allowed him to see of the command center's main display. Officers were moving with focused efficiency, calling out tactical updates and coordinating countermeasures while Commander Zekthor stood at the center like a crimson monument to Valorian combat doctrine. The commander was in his element now, his earlier fury channeled into precise military aggression, and his orders came in rapid succession as he maneuvered his ships to cut off the raiders' retreat. The second wave hit while the first was still being neutralized. These were heavier vessels, gunships with reinforced armor and plasma batteries capable of sustained bombardment. They emerged from the Theta corridor at a different angle, trying to flank the outpost while its defenders were engaged with the attack ships. The tactic might have worked against an unprepared station, but Marcus's sensor network had mapped all the possible approach vectors, and the patrol had positioned reserves to cover each one. 2 Krell cruisers broke formation and intercepted the gunships, their massive firepower matching the raiders shot for shot in a brutal exchange that lit up the void with energy discharge. The holding room shook as the outpost's defensive batteries opened fire. Marcus braced himself against the wall, feeling the vibrations travel through the station's superstructure as the massive railguns launched projectiles at relativistic speeds. The Galactic Patrol did not rely solely on energy weapons. They supplemented their plasma arrays with kinetic kill vehicles, solid slugs of dense metal accelerated to velocities that turned them into devastating projectiles. The mathematics of such weapons was simple and brutal. Mass times velocity equals force, and at speeds approaching significant fractions of light speed, even a small projectile could punch through capital ship armor. The third wave was the most dangerous. These were boarding craft, fast and maneuverable, designed to attach themselves to a station's hull and deploy assault teams directly into the corridors. There were 5 of them, and they came in low and fast while the outpost's guns were focused on the gunships. Marcus saw them on the tactical display and his breath caught. This was the nightmare scenario, the one that turned space battles into close-quarters combat where superior technology mattered less than raw ferocity and willingness to die. Raiders who chose boarding actions were usually desperate or fanatical, and either option made them incredibly dangerous. Commander Zekthor saw the threat immediately and diverted 2 interceptor squadrons to intercept the boarding craft. The small ships chased the raiders through the defensive perimeter, their weapons scoring hits, but not enough to stop all 5 vessels. 3 of the boarding craft exploded under sustained fire, their crews dying in silent flashes of light and debris. But 2 made it through, their armored hulls absorbing damage as they accelerated toward the outpost's lower docking ports. The station's automated defenses engaged, point defense turrets tracking the incoming craft with computer precision. One boarding ship took a direct hit to its propulsion system and tumbled away, venting atmosphere and spinning out of control. The final raider reached the hull and locked on with magnetic clamps, its cutting torches beginning the work of breaching the station's exterior plating. Alarms blared throughout the outpost as internal security teams scrambled to respond, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of combat training settling over him like an old uniform. The security officer guarding Marcus's holding room received orders through his communicator and hesitated, looking at Marcus with an expression that mixed uncertainty with something approaching respect. The officer was Krell, younger than most of his species in the patrol, and his voice was rough when he asked if Marcus knew how to fight. Marcus replied that he had fought in the Outer Rim conflicts, and that if the raiders breached the station, standing in a transparent box would not be particularly useful for anyone. The officer made a decision that would probably cost him his career and unlocked the holding room door. Marcus moved into the command center just as the breach alarm confirmed that the raiders had cut through the hull. They had entered through a docking port on the lower level, the same area where Marcus's hidden chamber was located, and they were moving fast toward the main lift shafts that would give them access to critical systems. Commander Zekthor was coordinating the defense from the command center, but he spared a glance at Marcus and growled that if the janitor thought he could help, He should get to the lower level and try to slow the raiders down before reinforcements arrived. The Therian security specialist was already moving toward the lift, her forearms checking weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency. She saw Marcus following and tossed him a plasma pistol without comment. The weapon was standard patrol issue, heavier than human military sidearms but familiar enough in its function. Marcus checked the charge and fell in beside the Therian as they descended toward the breach point, joined by a squad of 6 patrol officers including the young Krell who had released him. The lower level was chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, and the atmospheric processors were cycling frantically to compensate for the air loss from the breach. The raiders had established a beachhead near the docking port, using cargo containers as cover, while they set up heavy weapons to hold the corridor. There were at least 20 of them, a mix of species that suggested a mercenary operation rather than a unified military force. They wore mismatched armor and carried weapons from a dozen different manufacturers, but they moved with professional coordination, and their return fire was disciplined and accurate. The Therian took command of the defense automatically, positioning her officers to create overlapping fields of fire while staying behind cover. She called out targets and coordinated movements with the calm authority of someone who had done this many times before. Marcus found a position behind a structural support column and began firing at raiders who exposed themselves to advance. The plasma pistol kicked harder than he remembered, each shot releasing a burst of superheated gas that could melt through light armor, and his first 3 shots went wide before he adjusted for the weapon's characteristics. A raider carrying a heavy plasma rifle broke from cover and tried to reach the lift shaft. Marcus tracked him with the pistol and fired twice, the second shot catching the raider in the torso and dropping him. The body lay in the open, smoke rising from the scorched armor, and Marcus felt the old combat reflexes taking over. This was not maintenance work or cleaning duties. This was the kind of fighting where mistakes were immediately fatal and where survival depended on making decisions faster than conscious thought. The raiders concentrated their fire on the lift shaft, trying to destroy the controls and trap the patrol's reinforcements on the upper levels. The Therian saw the tactic and ordered her squad to focus on protecting the lift, even if it meant giving up ground elsewhere. 2 patrol officers moved to comply and were immediately hit by coordinated raider fire. One went down with a leg wound, the other took a plasma burst to the chest and collapsed without a sound. The young Krell officer who had released Marcus dragged the wounded officer back behind cover, while Marcus and the Therian provided suppressing fire. More raiders were coming through the breach now, reinforcing their beachhead with heavy weapons and portable shield generators. They were setting up for a sustained assault, which meant they were not just trying to disable the station, but to take control of it. Marcus recognized the pattern from his combat experience. These were not hit-and-run raiders looking for easy loot. This was an invasion force with specific objectives, and they had enough personnel and equipment to hold what they took. The Therian's communicator crackled with updates from the command center. The space battle outside was still raging, but the patrol was gaining the upper hand. Most of the raider fleet had been destroyed or driven off, and reinforcements were being diverted to deal with the boarding party. But those reinforcements would take time to arrive, and the raiders knew it. They were pushing hard to reach critical systems before the defense could solidify, and if they succeeded in taking the environmental processors or the main reactor, they could hold the entire station hostage. Marcus realized that the raiders' advance would take them directly past his hidden chamber. If they discovered the tunnel system, they would have access to routes throughout the station that the patrol's defensive positions were not designed to cover. The entire lower level could become a maze of ambush points and flanking positions that would turn every corridor into a death trap. He moved closer to the Therian and told her about the tunnel access near the maintenance junction. She understood immediately and ordered 2 officers to secure that position at any cost. But the raiders were faster. A group of them broke from the beachhead and rushed the maintenance junction, overwhelming the patrol officers with sheer aggression and superior numbers. The 2 defenders went down fighting, taking several raiders with them, but the junction fell and the invaders began examining the area for anything useful. Marcus watched from his position and knew with sick certainty that they would find the hidden hatch within minutes. Once they did, the battle would shift from a defensive holding action to a desperate hunt through tunnels where the raiders' numbers would matter more than the patrol's superior training. The decision crystallized in Marcus's mind with perfect clarity. He could stay behind cover and hope that reinforcements arrived before the raiders discovered the tunnels, or he could use his knowledge of the hidden passages to outmaneuver them and protect the access points from inside. The first option was safer and followed the chain of command. The second option was almost certainly suicide, but might actually make a difference. Marcus had spent 23 years making choices like this, weighing duty against survival, and every time the answer came out the same. He told the Therian what he was going to do, not asking for permission, but informing her so that at least someone would know where he had gone. The security specialist looked at him with all four eyes and said that going into the tunnels alone against a superior force was tactically insane. Marcus agreed, but pointed out that letting the raiders have free access to the station's entire underground network was strategically catastrophic. The Therian accepted this with a slight gesture that might have been respect or resignation, and she told Marcus that if he somehow survived, she would personally recommend him for commendation. Marcus moved through the firefight with the low profile and efficient movement of someone who had learned to survive by not presenting a target. He reached a secondary access corridor that paralleled the main passage and used it to circle around the raiders' position. The hidden hatch in the maintenance junction would be discovered soon, but there were other ways into the tunnel system, access points that Marcus had created over the years for exactly this kind of emergency. He reached one of them, a concealed panel behind the atmospheric processors, and slipped into the darkness below while the sounds of combat echoed above. The tunnel network was extensive, far more complex than the single chamber the investigation team had discovered. There were passages running beneath every major section of the outpost, connecting to emergency shelters and equipment caches that dated back to the original construction. Marcus moved through them with confidence born from decades of maintenance work, his feet finding the paths in the darkness while his hands trailed along the walls for guidance. He could hear the raiders above him now, their boots on the metal floors and their voices calling out in multiple languages as they searched the junction. They found the main hatch quickly, and Marcus heard the sounds of them descending into the primary chamber. There were at least 6 raiders in the group, moving cautiously but deliberately, and they were impressed by what they found. One of them called out that this was some kind of intelligence facility, and another responded that they should secure it and hold it as leverage. A third voice, rougher and carrying the authority of command, ordered them to spread out and search the entire network for other access points or resources. Marcus waited in a side passage while the raiders explored the main chamber. He had disabled most of the equipment before leaving to join the defense, shutting down the monitoring systems and encrypting the data so that casual observation would reveal nothing useful. But there were weapons in the chamber, secured in locked cabinets that would not take long to breach, and there were maps showing the full extent of the tunnel network. If the raiders got hold of those maps, they would own the lower level, and the patrol's defense would collapse. He moved deeper into the tunnels, heading for a secondary equipment cache that held items the Galactic Patrol would not approve of, and that Marcus had never mentioned in any official capacity. The cache was hidden behind a false wall in a passage that appeared to dead end, and it contained supplies that Marcus had accumulated over years of quiet preparation. There were demolition charges, military grade, rather than the commercial explosives used for construction. There were specialized weapons designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces, and there was a communication device that could bypass the station's standard channels and reach contacts that the patrol did not know existed. Marcus selected what he needed: 3 demolition charges, a compact assault weapon with a suppressor, and the communicator. He also grabbed a tactical harness that he had kept from his military service, adjusting the straps to fit over his janitor's uniform. The transformation felt strange and familiar at the same time, like putting on an old identity that he had tried to leave behind, but had never fully abandoned. He was not just a janitor anymore, not in this moment. He was what he had always been beneath the humble disguise, a soldier protecting the frontier because someone had to, and because the people who should have been doing the job had decided he was not worth their attention. The raiders were spreading through the tunnels now, and Marcus could track their progress by the sound. They were moving systematically, checking each passage and marking their route to avoid getting lost. There were more of them than he had initially estimated, at least 10 individuals in the tunnel network with more possibly waiting at the main hatch. Marcus was outnumbered and outgunned, fighting on terrain that he knew better than anyone, but that still favored the side with more bodies to occupy key positions. He set the first demolition charge in a passage that led from the main chamber toward the environmental processors. The charge was shaped to collapse the tunnel without damaging the systems above, a precise implosion that would seal the route and force the raiders to find another way. Marcus armed it with a remote detonator and moved on, heading for the second critical passage that gave access to the main reactor level. If the raiders reached the reactor, they could threaten to cause a meltdown that would destroy the entire outpost. That passage had to be sealed even more urgently than the first. He encountered his first raider while setting the second charge. The invader came around a corner without warning, weapon raised and ready, and for a frozen instant both men stared at each other in mutual surprise. The raider was Krell, young and aggressive, and he opened his mouth to shout an alarm. Marcus fired first, the suppressed weapon making a harsh cough that was quieter than a shout, but still loud enough to echo in the confined space. The raider went down, and Marcus dragged the body into a side passage, working quickly to hide the evidence and keep moving before others arrived to investigate. The second demolition charge went into place above the passage entrance, rigged to bring down enough debris to block access without causing structural damage to the reactor systems. Marcus armed it and continued deeper, heading for the third location where he would make his final stand. The tunnels forked in multiple directions here, a junction point that controlled access to half the underground network. If he could hold this position and force the raiders to come at him through narrow passages where their numbers meant less, he might survive long enough for the patrol's reinforcements to secure the upper levels and push down to relieve him. The communicator activated with a soft buzz, and the Therian security specialist's voice came through asking for Marcus's status. He reported his position and his actions, informing her that he had sealed 2 critical passages and was preparing to defend the main junction. The Therian acknowledged and said that reinforcements had arrived on the upper levels and were fighting their way down. Commander Zekthor had ordered all available personnel to retake the lower level and eliminate the raiders regardless of cost. If Marcus could hold his position for another 15 minutes, the patrol would reach him. 15 minutes was an eternity in combat, but Marcus had survived longer odds before. He positioned himself at the junction with good sight lines down 3 of the 4 passages and his back to a solid wall that nothing could breach without heavy equipment. The assault weapon had a full charge and 2 spare power cells, enough for sustained fire if he did not waste shots. The third demolition charge sat armed and ready in the 4th passage, set to detonate if raiders came through in force and could not be stopped by conventional means. The first raiders appeared at the end of the northern passage, moving in a tactical formation that showed professional training. They spotted Marcus immediately and opened fire, their plasma bolts scarring the walls and filling the air with superheated gas. Marcus returned fire from cover, dropping the lead raider and forcing the others to retreat behind a junction support. The exchange lasted seconds but felt longer, every moment stretched by the focus that came with knowing that mistakes were fatal. More raiders appeared in the eastern passage, trying to flank him while his attention was divided. Marcus switched targets and fired a burst that sent them scrambling back, then returned to the northern group who had advanced during the distraction. This was the kind of fighting that came down to resource management and spatial awareness, tracking multiple threats while conserving ammunition and maintaining position. Marcus had trained for this decades ago, had practiced it in simulators and in real combat, and muscle memory took over where conscious thought would have been too slow. The raiders coordinated their assault, pushing from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm his ability to respond. Marcus fought with cold efficiency, picking targets and managing his fields of fire while keeping the junction secure. He took a plasma burst to the shoulder that scorched through his uniform and burned the skin beneath, the pain sharp and immediate, but not debilitating. He kept fighting, kept holding, because the alternative was letting the raiders take the position, and with it any chance of containing their access to the station. Commander Zekthor's voice came through the communicator, demanding Marcus's status and whether the junction was secure. Marcus reported that he was engaged with multiple hostiles and holding position. The commander's response was brusque, but carried an edge that might have been concern. He said that patrol forces had retaken the main level and were advancing through the corridors toward the breach point. They would reach the tunnel entrance within 10 minutes and sweep the underground network clear of invaders. Marcus needed to maintain his position and stay alive until then. The raiders were regrouping, their initial assault broken but not defeated. Marcus could hear them communicating in the passages, arguing about tactics and casualties. They had lost at least 6 individuals in the fighting, and their confidence was shaken by encountering resistance in a place where they expected to have free movement. But they were not retreating, not yet. They had committed to the attack, and their commander was pushing them to complete the objective before the patrol's reinforcements arrived in overwhelming force. The final assault came from all 4 passages simultaneously, a desperate all-or-nothing push that threw every remaining raider at the junction. Marcus detonated the 3rd demolition charge, collapsing the southern passage and eliminating that entire attack vector in a controlled implosion of debris and dust. He fought the remaining directions with everything he had, the assault weapon running hot, and his movements mechanical with exhaustion and pain. Raiders fell and more took their places, their numbers slowly grinding down his ability to hold them off. A plasma bolt caught Marcus in the leg, and he went down, his weapon clattering away across the floor. A raider broke from cover and rushed forward, weapon raised for the kill shot. Marcus rolled, grabbed a fallen plasma pistol from the ground beside a dead invader, and fired upward into the attacker's unarmored neck. The raider collapsed on top of him, and Marcus shoved the body aside and tried to stand on his injured leg. The sound of Galactic Patrol weapons fire echoed from the northern passage, disciplined volleys that Marcus recognized as military precision. The reinforcements had arrived, and they were clearing the tunnels with overwhelming force and professional aggression. The remaining raiders broke and tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. They were caught between Marcus's position and the advancing patrol forces, and the tunnels became their tomb. Commander Zekthor appeared at the junction with a full combat squad, his plasma rifle still glowing from sustained fire. He looked at Marcus slumped against the wall, wounded and surrounded by dead raiders, and his expression was complicated. The Valorian commander said nothing for a long moment, then ordered his medic to treat Marcus's injuries and get him to the medical bay. As they carried Marcus away through the tunnels he had defended, past the evidence of what one determined human had accomplished against overwhelming odds, the outpost's alarms finally fell silent and the battle was over. Marcus woke in the medical bay 3 days after the battle, his body wrapped in regenerative bandages that hummed with bioelectric healing technology. The Krell physician who had once looked through him as though he were invisible now stood at his bedside reviewing medical scans with an expression that suggested professional interest rather than contempt. The doctor explained in careful terms that Marcus had suffered plasma burns to his shoulder and leg, multiple contusions, and significant blood loss, but that the regenerative treatments were accelerating his recovery beyond normal human healing rates. He would be mobile within a week and fully recovered within a month, assuming he followed the prescribed rest protocols. The medical bay was quieter than Marcus remembered from his previous visits, when he had come to restock supplies or perform maintenance on the environmental systems. Now there were other patients recovering from the battle, patrol officers in various states of injury occupying the beds around him. Some were unconscious, their bodies supported by medical equipment that breathed for them and monitored their vital signs. Others were awake and watching Marcus with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked disturbingly like respect. The Therian security specialist visited on the 2nd day of his consciousness, bringing a datapad and a formal expression that suggested official business. She sat beside his bed and informed him that Commander Zekthor had convened an inquiry into the events surrounding the raider attack, the discovery of the hidden tunnel network, and Marcus's unauthorized intelligence operations. The inquiry was standard procedure for any major security incident, and Marcus would be required to provide testimony once he was medically cleared. The Therian's tone was neutral, but her eyes conveyed a warning that the inquiry could go poorly depending on how the commander chose to frame the narrative. Marcus asked what had happened to the raider fleet, and the Therian provided a tactical summary with professional efficiency. The Galactic Patrol had destroyed or captured all 15 raider vessels, suffering moderate casualties and significant damage to 2 cruisers. The boarding party had been eliminated entirely, with no survivors among the invaders who had entered the station. Intelligence recovered from the captured ships indicated that the raiders were a mercenary force hired by a criminal syndicate operating in the frontier territories, and that Outpost 73 had been selected as a target specifically because surveillance suggested it was undermanned and complacent. The irony was not lost on Marcus. The raiders had chosen the outpost because they believed it would be an easy target, and they had been partially correct. Without the warning from his sensor network, without the preparation time his intelligence had provided, the attack might have succeeded. But because a humble janitor had been watching when nobody else was paying attention, the Galactic Patrol had been ready, and what should have been a catastrophic defeat had become a defensive victory that would be studied in tactical academies for years. The young Krell officer who had released Marcus from the holding room visited later that same day, bringing what appeared to be contraband food from the officer's mess. The Krell sat awkwardly in the visitor's chair, his massive frame making the furniture look comically inadequate, and admitted that he was probably going to face disciplinary action for his decision to let Marcus out during the battle. But he wanted Marcus to know that he did not regret it, that seeing a human fight with such courage had changed his understanding of what Earth species were capable of achieving. The Krell's name was Torvak, and he was only 3 years into his patrol service, young enough to still question the assumptions that older officers accepted without examination. Marcus thanked Torvak for the food and the honesty, and they talked for a while about combat and duty and the complicated relationship between following orders and doing what was right. Torvak confessed that he had grown up believing the Galactic Patrol's doctrine that humanity was a minor species, useful for support roles but lacking the qualities necessary for true military distinction. Watching Marcus hold the tunnel junction against overwhelming odds had shattered that belief, and now Torvak was wrestling with the realization that everything he had been taught about species hierarchies might be propaganda designed to justify a system that benefited some civilizations at the expense of others. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Zekthor himself, whose presence immediately filled the medical bay with tension. The Valorian dismissed Torvak with a gesture, waiting until the young officer had left before turning his attention to Marcus. The commander stood at the foot of the bed, his scaled features unreadable, and said that they needed to have a discussion about what happened before the inquiry began. His tone suggested that this was not a request. Commander Zekthor began by acknowledging that Marcus's intelligence had been accurate and that his actions during the battle had prevented the raiders from taking control of critical systems. The commander's voice was stiff, each word emerging as though being extracted against his will, but he continued with what was clearly a prepared statement. Marcus had demonstrated capabilities that were unexpected for someone in a maintenance position, and his service record from the Outer Rim conflicts had been reviewed and found to contain multiple commendations that the patrol's personnel system had somehow failed to flag when he was assigned to the outpost. Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing this for what it was. A commander trying to reconcile his prejudices with observable reality and not entirely succeeding. Zekthor moved on to the matter of the unauthorized tunnel network and the intelligence-gathering operations Marcus had conducted without patrol oversight. These activities were technically illegal, violations of multiple regulations regarding unsanctioned surveillance and unauthorized modification of military facilities. Under normal circumstances, such violations would result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges. However, the commander continued, these were not normal circumstances. The inquiry would need to balance the regulatory violations against the operational value of Marcus's actions, and there were political considerations that complicated the situation. If the patrol prosecuted Marcus for his unauthorized activities, they would also have to explain how those activities had saved the outpost when their own systems had failed to detect the threat. Such an explanation would be professionally embarrassing and might raise questions about the Galactic Patrol's competence that would reverberate all the way to the Confederation's Central Command. Marcus understood what the commander was really saying. The Galactic Patrol wanted to make this problem disappear in a way that preserved their reputation, while acknowledging that punishing Marcus would make them look petty and incompetent. Zekthor was here to negotiate a solution that served the institution's interests while giving Marcus enough consideration to prevent him from becoming an embarrassing martyr. It was politics dressed up as military pragmatism, and Marcus had seen it before in various forms throughout his career. The commander proposed what he called a reasonable compromise. Marcus would provide full testimony at the inquiry, documenting the extent of his intelligence network and his activities over the past 23 years. In exchange, the patrol would grant him retroactive authorization for his monitoring operations and reclassify his position from maintenance worker to intelligence analyst with appropriate rank and compensation. His tunnel network would be officially integrated into the Outpost security infrastructure, and he would be assigned personnel to help maintain and expand the sensor coverage. The unauthorized aspects would be reframed as initiative and resourcefulness rather than insubordination. Marcus considered the offer carefully. On the surface, it was generous, transforming him from a janitor facing criminal charges into an official intelligence asset with recognition and resources. But it also meant bringing his operations under patrol control, submitting to oversight and command structure that might limit his ability to act when bureaucracy conflicted with necessity. The network had been effective precisely because it operated in the shadows, because Marcus could make decisions without waiting for approval from officers who might not understand or care about subtle threats. He asked the commander what would happen to the other members of the informal network, the other veterans scattered across the frontier who maintained similar monitoring operations. Zekthor admitted that he did not know the full extent of the network, and that was one of the things the inquiry would seek to uncover. If there were other individuals conducting similar activities, the patrol would need to decide whether to integrate them into official operations or shut them down as security risks. The commander's preference was integration, but that decision would be made at levels above his authority. Marcus told the commander that he would cooperate with the inquiry and accept the proposed arrangement on one condition. Any other members of the network who were identified would receive the same offer of integration rather than prosecution, and their decades of unpaid service to frontier security would be recognized and compensated appropriately. Zekthor bristled at having conditions imposed by someone who had been a janitor days earlier, but he grudgingly agreed that the patrol could extend similar arrangements to other verified participants in the intelligence network. The commander left without further conversation, his posture radiating displeasure at having to negotiate with a human. Marcus lay back in his medical bed and stared at the ceiling, processing what had just happened. He had spent 23 years in obscurity, watching and waiting and preparing for threats that most people refused to acknowledge. Now he was being offered official recognition and resources, but at the cost of the independence that had made his work possible. It was not the outcome he had expected, and he was not certain whether it was actually a victory or simply a different kind of defeat. The Therian security specialist returned the following day with additional details about the inquiry process. Her name was Celera, and she had been assigned as Marcus's liaison to help him prepare his testimony and navigate the bureaucratic complexities of his situation. Celera explained that the inquiry would be conducted by a panel of 3 senior officers from patrol headquarters, individuals who had no direct connection to Outpost 73 and could theoretically provide objective assessment. However, she cautioned that objectivity was often theoretical rather than actual, and that Marcus should expect the panel to be influenced by institutional biases and political considerations. Marcus asked Celera why she was helping him, given that doing so might create problems for her own career. The Therian was quiet for a moment, her forearms folding in a gesture that suggested contemplation. She said that during the battle, she had watched Marcus fight with a courage and determination that reminded her why she had joined the Galactic Patrol in the first place. Not for the prestige or the power, but because someone needed to stand between innocent people and the chaos that wanted to consume them. She had seen too many officers forget that fundamental purpose, becoming more concerned with hierarchy and politics than with actual protection. Marcus had reminded her what service was supposed to look like, and she wanted to help ensure that his example was not wasted. The inquiry convened 1 week after Marcus was released from medical care. He walked into the hearing room with a slight limp from his healing leg wound, wearing a clean uniform that someone had provided since his janitor's coveralls had been destroyed in the battle. The room was configured formally, with the 3-officer panel seated at an elevated table and Marcus positioned at a lower podium where he would provide testimony. Commander Zekthor sat to one side as a witness, and Celera occupied a position near the back as an observer. Several other patrol officers were present, including Torvak, who had apparently decided that attending the inquiry was more important than avoiding trouble. The senior panel consisted of a Valorian admiral whose scales had faded to pale orange with age, a Therian general whose multiple arms were adorned with service medals, and a human captain whose presence was clearly meant to demonstrate the patrol's commitment to species diversity. The human officer was middle-aged and professional, with the kind of careful neutrality that came from spending a career navigating institutional politics as a representative of a species that most of the patrol considered inferior. Marcus recognized the type immediately and knew not to expect special consideration based on shared heritage. The Admiral opened the inquiry by outlining its scope and purpose. They were here to investigate the circumstances surrounding the Raider attack on Outpost 73, to assess the security implications of the unauthorized intelligence network discovered on the station, and to determine what actions were appropriate regarding the individuals involved. The inquiry was not a criminal trial, but its findings would inform decisions about disciplinary measures, policy changes, and resource allocation for frontier security operations. Marcus provided his testimony methodically, beginning with his service record from the Outer Rim conflicts and his subsequent assignment to Outpost 73 as a maintenance worker. He described discovering the original tunnel network shortly after his arrival, finding that it contained monitoring equipment left behind by earlier human exploration teams. Rather than reporting the discovery through official channels, where he believed it would be dismissed or dismantled, Marcus had chosen to maintain the systems and use them to supplement the patrol's surveillance capabilities. Over the following 23 years, Marcus explained, he had expanded the sensor network and established connections with other veterans who maintained similar operations at different frontier locations. They shared information informally, tracking patterns and anomalies that official systems often missed. The network was not intended to undermine the Galactic Patrol, but to fill gaps in coverage that existed because sophisticated technology sometimes had sophisticated blind spots. The group had prevented several incidents over the years, providing warnings that allowed local commanders to respond to threats before they escalated into major conflicts. The Therian general interrupted to ask why Marcus had never sought official authorization for these activities. Marcus replied honestly that he had attempted to report anomalies and security concerns through proper channels multiple times during his early years at the Outpost, and each time his input had been dismissed or ignored because it came from a human maintenance worker with no official intelligence credentials. After enough rejections, he had stopped trying to work within a system that clearly did not value his contributions and had instead focused on doing what he could independently. The human captain asked about the specific intelligence regarding the Raider attack, how Marcus had detected the threat when the patrol's own systems had not. Marcus explained the technical details, describing how the old sensor network operated on frequencies and principles that modern stealth technology was not designed to evade. The Raiders had invested heavily in systems that could fool sophisticated AI-driven surveillance, but those systems were transparent to the kind of basic electromagnetic sensing that predated current military doctrine. It was the same principle that made ancient radio telescopes sometimes more useful than quantum arrays for certain types of astronomical observation. Commander Zekthor provided his testimony next, confirming that Marcus's intelligence had been accurate and that the advanced warning had allowed the patrol to prepare adequate defenses. Without that warning, the commander admitted with visible reluctance, the outpost would likely have been overwhelmed and the casualties would have been catastrophic. Zekthor also testified about Marcus's actions during the battle, his defense of the tunnel junction against superior numbers, and the strategic value of preventing the Raiders from gaining access to the underground network. Silara testified about her observations during the investigation and the battle, providing a tactical assessment that emphasized Marcus's competence and courage. She noted that his actions had been consistent with someone who had extensive military training and combat experience, and that dismissing such capabilities simply because of his official position had been an institutional failure that should inform future personnel policies. The Therian general seemed particularly interested in this testimony, asking detailed questions about how the patrol's assignment system had failed to recognize Marcus's qualifications when he was placed in a maintenance role. The inquiry proceeded through additional witnesses and evidence review, building a comprehensive record of events. By the end of the second day, a picture had emerged that was uncomfortable for the Galactic Patrol's institutional pride. They had assigned a decorated combat veteran to janitorial duties without bothering to review his service record. They had ignored his attempts to contribute to security operations because his species and position made his input seem irrelevant. They had developed surveillance systems that were vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that Marcus's primitive sensors had detected. And when crisis came, they had been saved by the initiative and sacrifice of the person they had most thoroughly dismissed. The panel deliberated for less than an hour before announcing their findings. The Admiral read the decision in a formal tone that made clear this was official policy rather than personal opinion. The inquiry found that Marcus Webb's unauthorized intelligence operations, while technically in violation of regulations, had been motivated by legitimate security concerns and had provided demonstrable value to frontier defense. His actions during the Raider attack were consistent with the highest standards of military service and deserved recognition rather than punishment. Therefore, the panel recommended that Marcus be granted retroactive authorization for his intelligence activities and offered a position as Senior Intelligence Analyst for Frontier Operations with appropriate rank and compensation. His sensor network would be officially integrated into patrol security infrastructure, and similar arrangements would be extended to other verified members of the informal network. Additionally, the patrol would review its personnel assignment procedures to ensure that qualified individuals were not relegated to inappropriate positions due to species bias or administrative oversight. The Admiral concluded by noting that Marcus Webb's service exemplified the principles that the Galactic Patrol was supposed to represent: vigilance, courage, and commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. His example would be documented in training materials and his methods studied for potential application in other frontier sectors. The inquiry was closed, and Marcus was free to accept or decline the position offered. Marcus stood at the podium, aware that every eye in the room was on him. He thought about the 23 years he had spent cleaning floors and watching in silence, the countless times he had been dismissed or ignored, the moments when he had questioned whether his efforts made any difference. He thought about the veterans scattered across the frontier who had made similar choices, who had continued serving even when their service was neither recognized nor appreciated. And he thought about what acceptance of this offer would mean, both for himself and for the principle that value could be found in unexpected places if people were willing to look. He accepted the position, but he also made a request. He asked that the patrol establish a formal program to identify and utilize personnel whose capabilities exceeded their current assignments, regardless of species or background. There were probably dozens or hundreds of individuals like him throughout the organization, people with skills and experience that were being wasted because nobody had bothered to look beyond surface assumptions. If the Galactic Patrol was serious about improving its operations, it needed to stop measuring worth by origin and start measuring it by contribution. The panel agreed to take his recommendation under advisement, which was the bureaucratic way of saying they would think about it without making promises. But the human captain caught Marcus's eye as the inquiry concluded, and there was something in that look that suggested at least one member of the panel understood exactly what he was saying and why it mattered. Change would come slowly if it came at all, but perhaps this was a beginning. Marcus left the hearing room with Solara and Torvak, the three of them walking together through corridors that Marcus had cleaned 1,000 times, but now moved through as something other than invisible. Officers nodded as they passed, some with respect and others with lingering uncertainty, but none with the casual dismissal that had defined his existence for more than 2 decades. The transformation was disorienting, and Marcus was not entirely sure how he felt about it. Recognition was gratifying, but it also meant that he could no longer operate in the shadows where he had done his best work. They reached the lower level where Marcus's quarters were located, and Torvak asked what Marcus planned to do now that he had official authority and resources. Marcus considered the question while looking at the familiar maintenance equipment, the cleaning supplies and diagnostic tools that had been his companions for so long. He said that he would probably do exactly what he had been doing, watching and listening and preparing for threats that others might miss. The difference was that now he would have help, and maybe together they could build something more effective than one person working alone in the dark. Solara said that she had been assigned as his deputy, tasked with helping him integrate the informal network into official operations and training new personnel in his methods. She had reviewed his sensor data and his analytical logs, and she was impressed by the depth and consistency of his work. With proper support and expanded resources, she believed they could establish a frontier intelligence system that would make another surprise attack virtually impossible. It would require convincing skeptical officers and overcoming institutional resistance, but after what had happened at Outpost 73, there was momentum for change that they could leverage. Marcus looked at his two companions, a Therian security specialist who had chosen principle over convenience, and a young Krell officer who had learned that courage came in unexpected forms. He thought about the community they might build, the network of individuals who watched the frontier because someone had to, and because doing the right thing mattered more than receiving recognition for it. It would not be easy, and there would be setbacks and opposition from those who preferred the comfortable certainty of their prejudices. But it was possible, and possibility was more than Marcus had allowed himself to hope for in a very long time. He smiled for the first time since the battle and said that they should probably get started. There was still a frontier to watch, still threats emerging in the darkness between stars, and now they had the tools and the authority to do something about it. The humble janitor had stepped into the light, and in doing so, had opened a path for others who had been waiting in the shadows for their chance to prove that humanity's hidden strength was real and valuable and worthy of respect. The work continued, but now it continued with recognition, and that made all the difference. 6 months after the inquiry, Outpost 73 had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The most obvious change was the new intelligence wing constructed adjacent to the main operations center, a dedicated facility with advanced monitoring equipment and secure communication arrays. The less obvious change was the shift in atmosphere, the way personnel moved through the corridors with a different kind of awareness, as though they had learned to see things that had always been present but previously invisible. Marcus stood in the intelligence center reviewing sensor feeds from across the frontier sector. His new position as senior intelligence analyst came with a proper office, but he spent most of his time in the operations room where data streamed in from dozens of sources. The old sensor network had been expanded and integrated with the patrol's official systems, creating a hybrid surveillance capability that combined sophisticated technology with the time-tested methods that had served humanity's early exploration efforts. It was not perfect, but it was significantly more comprehensive than anything the Galactic Patrol had operated before. Celara worked at the adjacent station, her forearms moving across multiple interfaces with practiced coordination. She had adapted quickly to the analytical work, bringing her tactical experience and natural talent for pattern recognition to the intelligence role. Together, they had identified 17 other veterans maintaining similar operations at frontier outposts, and 15 of them had accepted offers to formalize their activities under patrol authority. The remaining 2 had declined politely, preferring to continue their independent watch, and Marcus had respected that decision enough to ensure they received supplies and support without official strings attached. The intelligence team had grown to include 8 full-time analysts and a rotating staff of field operatives who collected information from sources that automated systems could not access. Torvak had requested transfer to the unit after completing advanced training in human intelligence methods, becoming one of the first Krell officers to specialize in a field that his species had traditionally considered beneath their warrior culture. His presence symbolized the broader change happening throughout the patrol, the gradual recognition that different approaches and perspectives created strength rather than weakness. Commander Zekthor had been promoted to Regional Operations Director, a position that gave him authority over multiple outposts and required him to spend significant time at headquarters. His replacement was a Valorian captain named Sethis, who had reviewed Marcus's case files during the inquiry and concluded that frontier security needed innovation more than tradition. Sethis was younger than Zekthor and less invested in the hierarchies that had defined the patrol for generations. She treated Marcus as a valued advisor rather than a problematic subordinate, and their working relationship had developed into something approaching mutual respect. The sensor network had detected 3 potential threats in the months since its official integration, situations where hostile forces were probing the frontier's defenses or positioning for opportunistic raids. In each case, early warning had allowed the patrol to respond before the threats materialized into actual attacks. The success rate was building Marcus's reputation within the organization, and he received regular inquiries from other sectors asking for advice on establishing similar capabilities. He answered these requests patiently, sharing methodology and lessons learned, helping to build a community of practice that extended beyond his immediate team. But success brought its own complications. There were officers who resented the attention Marcus received, who saw his prominence as evidence that the patrol was abandoning its standards and catering to species that had not earned their positions through traditional advancement. These critics argued that exceptions made for one individual would undermine discipline and create expectations that the organization could not sustainably meet. Marcus understood their concerns even if he disagreed with their conclusions. Change was always uncomfortable for those who had benefited from existing systems, and resistance was a natural response to having comfortable assumptions challenged. The political dimension was more complex than Marcus had anticipated. His story had spread beyond the patrol, becoming known in civilian circles and among the human populations scattered across frontier worlds. Some saw him as a hero, proof that humanity could achieve recognition in institutions dominated by older civilizations. Others were more cynical, arguing that the patrol's acceptance of Marcus was performative rather than genuine, a public relations gesture designed to deflect criticism without addressing deeper systemic issues. Marcus tried to stay focused on the work rather than the politics, but he could not entirely escape the reality that he had become a symbol whether he wanted to be or not. The Therian general from the inquiry panel visited Outpost 73 3 months after the new intelligence wing opened. General Kava arrived without ceremony, touring the facilities and speaking privately with team members about their work and experiences. She spent several hours with Marcus reviewing case studies and discussing the challenges of scaling the hybrid surveillance model to other sectors. At the end of the visit, she told Marcus that his success had convinced the patrol's senior leadership to establish a formal frontier intelligence division and that they wanted him to help design its structure and training protocols. Marcus was honored by the offer, but also hesitant. The position would require relocating to headquarters, spending most of his time in meetings and administrative work rather than actual monitoring and analysis. He would have more influence over policy and resource allocation, but he would be further removed from the frontline work that he understood best. General Kava acknowledged the trade-off and suggested that Marcus consider whether his skills were more valuable in operational execution or strategic development. Some people were natural practitioners, she said, while others were natural architects who could see how systems should fit together. Marcus did not have to choose immediately, but the question was worth contemplating. That evening, Marcus walked the lower-level corridors as he had done countless times over the past 23 years. The maintenance equipment was still there, though he no longer used it himself. A new janitor had been hired, a young human woman named Chen who had served in auxiliary logistics during the border conflicts. Marcus had met with her briefly during her orientation, recognizing in her eyes the same determination to prove worth that he had carried for decades. He had told her that if she noticed anything unusual or concerning, she should report it directly to the intelligence center rather than waiting for permission from supervisors who might not listen. Chen had understood immediately what he was really saying, and she had thanked him for the trust. The hidden tunnel network remained accessible, though it was now officially documented and regularly inspected. Marcus descended through the main hatch, the ladder familiar beneath his hands, and stood in the chamber that had been his private domain for so long. The equipment hummed with the same steady rhythm, but now there were additional systems integrated into the space and other personnel who worked here during different shifts. It was no longer his alone, and that felt both right and strangely melancholy. He had built something worth sharing, but sharing meant releasing control and accepting that others would shape its future. Solara found him there an hour later, sitting at the original workstation where he had spent thousands of hours watching and analyzing. She asked if he was considering General Kava's offer, and Marcus admitted that he was uncertain. The work at Outpost 73 felt unfinished, but the opportunity to influence how the entire patrol approached frontier intelligence was significant. Solara said that she could understand both perspectives, and that whatever Marcus decided, she wanted him to know that his impact had already exceeded anything one person could reasonably hope to achieve. He had changed minds and policies, proven that assumptions about species' capabilities were limited and limiting, and created a model that would continue developing regardless of whether he personally guided it. Marcus appreciated her words, but he knew that institutional change was fragile and could be reversed if champions stopped pushing. The patrol had accepted his methods because circumstances forced them to acknowledge effectiveness, but acceptance under pressure was different from genuine transformation. If he left before the new approaches were fully embedded in doctrine and culture, there was risk that old patterns would reassert themselves once the immediate crisis memory faded. Conversely, if he stayed focused on one outpost, he might miss the chance to prevent that regression by shaping policy at a level where it would persist beyond individual personalities. They talked for a while longer, weighing options and considering implications. Solara mentioned that she had been offered promotion to head the intelligence operation at Outpost 73 if Marcus accepted the headquarters position. She had the skills and the command respect to maintain what they had built, and she would ensure that the team continued developing according to the principles they had established together. Torvak was also advancing rapidly, his combination of combat experience and analytical ability making him valuable for both operations and training roles. The foundation was stronger than it appeared, built on people rather than just procedures. Marcus made his decision over the following week after consulting with team members and reviewing his own priorities. He accepted General Kava's offer, but with conditions. He would spend half his time at headquarters developing policy and training programs, and the other half rotating through frontier outposts to maintain operational awareness and connection to fieldwork. He would not become purely administrative, isolated from the realities that made intelligence work effective or futile. The general agreed to these terms, recognizing that Marcus's value came partly from his refusal to lose touch with practical implementation. The transition happened gradually over the next 2 months. Marcus trained his replacement thoroughly, documenting processes and introducing key contacts in the informal network that still operated alongside official channels. He worked with Solara to establish protocols for the hybrid model, ensuring that the integration of old and new methods would persist after his direct involvement ended. He met with Captain Sethis to discuss how the outpost's command structure should interact with intelligence operations, emphasizing the importance of treating analysts as partners rather than subordinates and actually listening when they raised concerns. His final week at Outpost 73 included a formal recognition ceremony that made Marcus profoundly uncomfortable. Captain Sethis presented him with commendations for valor and distinguished service, reading citations that described his actions during the Raider battle and his contributions to frontier security. The assembled personnel applauded, and Marcus stood at attention feeling exposed in a way that combat had never made him feel. He had spent most of his life trying to be invisible, and now he was being celebrated in front of everyone. The irony was not lost on him, though he was not certain whether to laugh or cringe. After the ceremony, there was an informal gathering where team members shared stories and expressed appreciation for what Marcus had taught them. Torvak gave a speech in which he admitted that meeting Marcus had fundamentally changed his understanding of what made someone worthy of respect. Chen, the new janitor, presented Marcus with a small token, a cleaning rag embroidered with the Intelligence Division's insignia. She said it was a reminder that important work often looked ordinary from the outside, and that the most valuable people were sometimes the ones everyone else overlooked. Marcus accepted the gift with genuine gratitude and promised to keep it as a reminder of where he came from and why his work mattered. The transport to headquarters departed the following morning. Marcus boarded with a single bag containing his personal effects and the embroidered cleaning rag carefully folded inside. He looked back at Outpost 73 through the viewport, seeing the structure that had been his home for 23 years gradually shrink into the distance. It looked different now than when he had first arrived, not physically, but in what it represented. Then it had been a place of exile and dismissal, where he had been sent because nobody knew what else to do with a human veteran who would not quietly disappear. Now it was a symbol of what could happen when people looked beyond surface judgments and recognized value in unexpected places. Headquarters was located on Centris Prime, the capital world of the Confederation of Advanced Worlds and the administrative heart of Galactic Patrol operations. The planet was a monument to successful interspecies cooperation, with architecture that blended design principles from dozens of civilizations and infrastructure that accommodated the needs of radically different biology and culture. Marcus had visited once before, decades ago when he had received his original commendations, and he remembered being overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of everything. This visit was different. He arrived not as a supplicant hoping for recognition, but as an expert whose methods had proven their worth. General Cava met him personally at the transport terminal, accompanied by her staff and several senior officers who wanted to discuss frontier intelligence doctrine. The general introduced Marcus to the team he would be working with, a diverse group of analysts and strategists from various species who had been studying his case files and were eager to learn from his experience. Their questions were specific and technically sophisticated, and Marcus realized with some surprise that they were treating him as a peer rather than a curiosity. The headquarters complex was vast, with entire buildings dedicated to different aspects of patrol operations. Marcus was assigned office space in the Strategic Intelligence Directorate, a secure facility where analysts studied long-term patterns and developed threat assessments for command decision-making. His office was modest but functional, with view screens for data visualization and secure terminals for accessing classified information. It was a significant upgrade from the hidden chamber beneath Outpost 73, but Marcus found himself missing the simplicity of his old workspace. The work itself was intellectually demanding in ways that operational intelligence was not. Marcus spent his days reviewing reports from across the frontier, identifying patterns that suggested emerging threats or shifting power dynamics. He participated in strategy sessions where senior officers debated resource allocation and policy priorities, contributing perspectives that others often had not considered. He developed training curricula for new intelligence specialists, drawing on his experience to teach both technical skills and the mindset necessary for effective monitoring. And he traveled regularly to frontier outposts, conducting assessments and providing guidance while maintaining his connection to fieldwork. The challenges were different at headquarters. Instead of watching for raiders or scanning for anomalies, Marcus navigated bureaucratic politics and institutional resistance. There were officers who supported his methods enthusiastically, who saw the Frontier Intelligence Division as a necessary innovation. But there were also factions who viewed it as a wasteful concession to political pressure, a symbolic gesture that diverted resources from traditional military capabilities. Marcus learned to build coalitions and craft arguments in terms that skeptics could accept, emphasizing operational effectiveness rather than ideological principles. One of his most important projects was establishing the Veterans Recognition Program, an initiative designed to identify qualified personnel who had been underutilized due to administrative oversight or bias. The program reviewed service records systematically, looking for individuals whose skills and experience exceeded their current assignments. When matches were found, personnel were offered opportunities for reassignment or additional training that better aligned with their capabilities. The program was controversial, with critics arguing that it undermined the existing promotion system, but it had already identified more than 200 individuals whose talents were being wasted. Marcus also worked to formalize the relationship between official intelligence operations and the informal network of veteran watchers. Rather than trying to absorb the network entirely, which would destroy the independence that made it effective, he established a liaison system that allowed information sharing without command authority. The informal network remained autonomous, but could access patrol resources when needed, and their insights fed into official analysis without requiring bureaucratic approval. It was a delicate balance that satisfied neither purists who wanted complete control nor idealists who wanted complete independence, which Marcus took as evidence that he had probably found the right compromise. 18 months after leaving Outpost 73, Marcus attended a conference on frontier security doctrine where he was invited to present his findings on hybrid intelligence systems. The audience included senior officers from multiple sectors, civilian oversight officials, and representatives from member civilizations who wanted to understand how the patrol's methods were evolving. Marcus spoke for 90 minutes, describing the limitations of over-reliance on sophisticated technology and the value of maintaining diverse monitoring capabilities. He illustrated his points with case studies, showing how the combination of advanced and traditional methods created resilience against threats designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities. The response was mixed but generally positive. Several officers approached Marcus afterward to discuss implementation in their sectors, and the civilian officials seemed pleased that the patrol was demonstrating adaptability and innovation. There were also pointed questions from skeptics who wanted to know whether Marcus's success was replicable or whether it depended on unique circumstances that could not be systematically reproduced. Marcus acknowledged the concern honestly, admitting that no system worked everywhere, but arguing that the principle of methodological diversity was broadly applicable even if specific techniques required local adaptation. That evening, Marcus received a message from Solera reporting that Outpost 73 had detected and neutralized another radar probe using the integrated sensor network. The operation had gone smoothly, with the team responding exactly as trained and achieving their objectives without casualties. Solera's message was professional, but included a personal note saying that Marcus's legacy continued and that everyone missed his presence, but understood why he had moved on. Marcus read the message several times, feeling simultaneously proud and melancholy. His work there had succeeded well enough that they no longer needed him, which was exactly what he had hoped for, and somehow still felt like loss. General Cava summoned Marcus to her office the following week with news that would reshape his role yet again. The Confederation's Central Council had reviewed the Frontier Intelligence Division's performance and concluded that the model should be expanded beyond military operations. They wanted to establish a civilian version focused on economic security, migration patterns, and other non-military threats that affected frontier populations. Marcus was being asked to consult on the design of this civilian intelligence network, helping to translate military methods into contexts where armed force was inappropriate, but systematic monitoring remained valuable. The scope of what Marcus was building had expanded far beyond what he had imagined in the hidden chamber beneath the outpost. He had started by trying to protect one station from threats that nobody else would acknowledge, and now he was helping shape how multiple civilizations approached the challenge of maintaining security in complex, dynamic environments. It was gratifying but also overwhelming, and Marcus sometimes wondered whether he was the right person for responsibilities that had grown so large. General Cava assured him that doubt was appropriate for anyone doing genuinely important work, and that the officers who never questioned their own adequacy were the ones who should not be trusted with significant authority. Marcus continued his work, traveling between headquarters and frontier posts, teaching and learning and adapting methods to new contexts. He maintained contact with Solara and Torvak and the others at Outpost 73, following their careers as they advanced into positions of increasing responsibility. He watched Chen develop her own monitoring capabilities and eventually take a position in the intelligence division, bringing fresh perspectives that built on his foundation while going in directions he had not anticipated. The community he had helped create was growing and diversifying, becoming something more robust than any single person's vision. 5 years after the Raider attack that had changed everything, Marcus returned to Outpost 73 for an anniversary commemoration. The station had expanded significantly, with additional defensive installations and improved living quarters for increased personnel. The intelligence wing that Marcus had helped establish was now the model that other outposts tried to emulate, and its success had made the frontier notably safer than it had been. Captain Sethis, now promoted to commander, led a ceremony honoring those who had defended the outpost during the battle and acknowledging the transformation that had followed. Marcus stood before the assembled personnel, many of whom had not been present during the original events, and reflected on what had changed and what had remained constant. The Galactic Patrol was still an imperfect institution, still struggling with biases and bureaucratic inertia, still making decisions that prioritized politics over effectiveness. But it was also learning, adapting, becoming more willing to recognize value regardless of where it came from. The change was incremental and fragile, but it was real, and it mattered to the people whose lives and safety depended on the patrol's capability and judgment. He visited the lower level one final time, descending through the tunnel network that had started everything. The chamber was busy now, with analysts working multiple shifts and equipment upgraded beyond anything Marcus had originally maintained. But the core purpose remained the same: watching the frontier, identifying threats, protecting people who often did not know they needed protecting. Marcus sat at his old workstation for a few minutes, feeling the weight of history and continuity, remembering the years of solitude and invisibility that had taught him what really mattered. Silara found him there, just as she had years earlier when he was contemplating his decision to leave. She sat beside him, and they talked about how the work had evolved and where it might go next. There were always new threats emerging, new patterns to identify, new challenges that required adaptation and innovation. The frontier was not becoming safer, so much as the dangers were becoming more sophisticated, and maintaining security required constant vigilance and willingness to question assumptions. It was exhausting and necessary, and both of them understood that their work would never truly be finished. They climbed back to the main level together, emerging into the bustling activity of a station that had learned to see value in unexpected places. Officers nodded to Marcus with genuine respect rather than dismissive tolerance, and several stopped to thank him for his contributions to their training or career development. It was surreal compared to his years of invisibility, but Marcus had learned to accept recognition without letting it define him. He was still the person who had cleaned floors and watched in silence, and that person's perspective remained valuable precisely because it came from outside the hierarchies that shaped most officers' understanding. Before departing, Marcus met with Chen in what had once been his maintenance workshop. She had transformed the space into a secondary monitoring station, maintaining the equipment while using it for her own intelligence gathering. Chen showed Marcus some of the patterns she had been tracking, threats too subtle for automated systems, but potentially significant if they developed into something larger. Her analysis was sophisticated and her instincts were sound, and Marcus felt confident that the tradition of humble watchers would continue regardless of what official positions people held. He gave Chen the embroidered cleaning rag she had gifted him years earlier, telling her that it belonged here where the work continued rather than in his office at headquarters, where it would become merely symbolic. Chen accepted it with understanding, hanging it on the wall beside her workstation, where it would remind her and others that important work often wore ordinary disguises. They shook hands and Marcus left the workshop, closing the door on a chapter of his life that had given him purpose and meaning beyond anything he had expected when he first arrived at this forgotten outpost on the frontier's edge. The transport back to headquarters carried Marcus away from Outpost 73 for what he suspected would be the last time. His work had evolved beyond any single location, and his responsibilities now spanned systems and sectors that he would never personally visit. But the lessons learned in that hidden chamber beneath the maintenance junction remained central to everything he taught and every system he designed. Watch carefully. Question assumptions. Trust that value exists in unexpected places. And remember that the people who seem most ordinary are sometimes the ones doing the most important work, if anyone bothers to look beyond surface appearances. Marcus Webb had started as a humble janitor, dismissed and invisible, protecting a frontier that did not know he existed. He ended as an architect of security systems that would outlast him, a teacher whose students would carry his methods into contexts he could not imagine, and a symbol of what could be achieved when determination met opportunity, and when one person's courage inspired others to question what they had been taught to believe. The journey had been longer and stranger than anything he could have predicted, but looking back as the stars streamed past his viewport, Marcus knew that every moment of invisibility and struggle had been worth it. He had made a difference, and that was enough. The frontier continued, vast and dangerous and full of possibility, watched over by networks of people who understood that security required both sophisticated technology and the kind of humble vigilance that noticed what others missed. The humble janitor's legacy lived in every analyst who questioned official certainties, every officer who looked beyond species hierarchies, and every person who chose to protect others even when recognition seemed impossible. Marcus had shown that humanity's hidden strength was real and valuable, and in doing so had opened doors that would never fully close. The work continued, carried forward by those who understood what he had taught through example, that everyone matters, that every perspective has value, and that the most important guardians are often the ones nobody remembers to thank. And that was exactly how it should be.